Hello, everybody. This is Jim Ransom, and today we're going to read some of the outstanding poems of the 18th century. These will be from England or Scotland, where poetry in the post-Shakespeare era had taken on a rather pastoral tone most of the time, and was written by men, mostly, some women, and they tended to share some common visions. This was called the Romantic era, and a lot of times the poetry that was printed at that time or written at that time was Romantic poetry, of course. First of all, I'd like to diverge just a little bit from my main theme. I'm always looking for what I like to call everyday poetry. This is poetry written by people who are not poets, but deeply involved in other pursuits. And I found one just the past couple of weeks. This is an example of what I call everyday poetry. And it came from some instructions which were attached to a bouquet of fresh flowers, of all things. And on the instruction sheet, it started out with the caution, for maximum enjoyment, the first thing you have to do is be sure to add water daily. Lots of it. Keep them away from direct sun, hot furnace vents, and TV cables, and watch to see if they get sulky or murky, which often means they need more water. And finally, remember, these little ones can be really hard on furniture, so you may need to protect it. I thought when I read that, this would be also very good advice for new parents. But it turns out that the advice on this sheet is written in iambic quatrain form, and while the lines don't rhyme, they actually create a poem. I don't think the person who wrote this thought of themselves as writing poetry, but I would give them credit for it. He or she had a poetic flow of words and ideas. Now let's switch back to the poetry of the 18th and early 19th century, which has been styled Romantic poetry. We're talking about the poetry of Wordsworth, Keats, Byron, Shelley, Robert Burns, and then poets like Longfellow in America. There were so many poets then, not as many, I think, as we have now, but there were a lot of them. And mostly they wrote long poems. And why was that, do you think? Well, they had so little competition. There were no TV sets, no radios, and no poetry recitations to speak of, except perhaps in taverns and at parties. And so the poems could be long. People would buy the books and read them on a long afternoon or in an evening, if they had enough light. And they were a major form of entertainment. And so people had time to read long poems in that day and age, but no more. I'm going to start out by reading a poem by Robert Burns, or as he would have called it, Robert Burns. because the Scots, in the original border Scots dialect, they roll their R's rather dramatically. Poems in dialect I don't really like to read because I'm not that good at it, but I have to try with this one to give you a wee taste of what a Burns poem was like. So let me see if I can find this, and then we'll get it read. Here it is. Oh, yeah, by the way, where am I finding this poem? Well, it's in this vast book of poetry, which I have kept since my days in college at Stanford. Or, no, this course I took at the University of Iowa. It's called English Romantic Poetry and Prose by a fellow whose name was Noyes. And the book is full of poetry, of course, but it also gives rather lengthy biographies of most of the poets. So now, and I found marks in this book that I had made with a pencil when I was a student. And one of the poems that I had read at that time was To a Mouse by Robert Burns. Okay, To a mouse on turning her up in her nest with the plow, November 1785. Wee sleekit cowrin timorous beastie, oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. Thou need not start awa sae hasty with bicker and prattle. I would be laith to ren and chase thee with murdering pattle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies an ill opinion. What makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal? I doubt now whiles, but thou may thieve. What then? Poor beastie, thou maun live. A daemonicker and a thrave, sa sma request. I'll get a blessing with a lave, and never miss it. Thy wee bit housey too in ruin. It's silly was the winds are strewin', and naething now to big a new one. O foggage green, and bleak December's winds ensuing, baith snell and keen, and cozy here beneath the blast thou thought to dwell, till crash the cool coulter passed out through thy cell. That wee bit heap o' leaves and stibble has cost thee mony a weary nibble. Now thou's turned out for all thy trouble, but house or hold, to thole the winter's sleety dribble, and cranroik cold. But, mousie, thou art know thy lane, improving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes will mice and men gang afterglay, and leave us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, thou art blessed compared with me. The present only toucheth thee, but I backward cast my e'e on prospects drear, and forward though I cannot see, I guess and fear. Well, I hope you understood a little of that. I'm going to make a quick run through here to explain some of the words, but I'll miss some of them, I'm sure. Where he says, "We sleekit cowrin timorous beastie." Sleekit just simply means sleek, describing the mouse's tight fur. Oh, what a panic's in thy breasty. And that's the mouse's breast. Thou need not start away so hasty. You don't need to run away so quickly with bicker and brattle. You don't need to run away in such scampering haste. Bicker and brattle is scampering haste. I would be loath to run and chase thee. I don't have any interest in running and chasing you with a murderous stick. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. He's trying to explain to the mouse that they have a lot in common. I'm sure the mouse did not think so at that point. Thy wee bit housey house in ruin, and its silly ways the winds are strewing. It's silly, the winds are strewing the results. And he's talking about, you can make a new one out of foggage green. Foggage refers to grass, coarse grass that's growing wild. And let's see what else here. Till crash, the cruel coulter passed out through thy cell. Coulter is the part of the plow that is going through the mouse's nest. And so then the word thole, it says you were hoping to thole. That means to thrive. The winter's sleety drizzle, and then there's this word kranreich, and that means hoarfrost. Hoarfrost. Kranreich, cold hoarfrost, and so on. But anyway, the most memorable part of this poem is in the stanza next to the end, where he says, the best laid schemes, O mice and men, gang after gley, and lay us naught but grief and pain for promised joy. And I think most of you have heard that phrase. The best laid plans of mice and men gang after gley. And that means going awry, gang aft the gley. Yeah. Okay, well, that's a fun poem to read to a mouse, and a very original subject. But this was kind of the way Robert Burns wrote his poetry. Robert Burns was not a scholar like Walter Scott, who came somewhat after him, and also wrote in a Scottish way. But Robert Burns was, he left a trail of unwanted, I won't say that, but a trail of, let us say, bastard children behind him. That's about the most honest way to describe it. He was a ladies' man, and oh my goodness, the young ladies at the time, not very sophisticated out in the country, were easily led astray by this wandering poet. So, in those days, long before we had birth control, Robert Burns probably has his genes half of the Scottish countryside, as far as I can tell. Well, we're going to leave that and move on. Here is a poem by probably the leading romantic poet, and that was William Wordsworth. And here's one that he wrote a lot of long poems. I'm going to try to avoid them. But here's one that's not so long. It's called I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, written at Town End, Grasmere. The daffodils grew and still grow on the margin of Ullswater. That's a lake there. And probably may be seen to this day as beautiful in the month of March. That's a note by Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not be but gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. That's a fairly typical, but much shorter than average poem by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth lived to be 85 years old, and during that time, he was a very successful poet. He made a fortune writing poetry, which is pretty rare then as of now, and he became the Poet Laureate of England, served in that capacity for at least 2 years, I think. And it's amazing what he accomplished in the literary way. He was the son of a lawyer, and the lawyer worked mostly for the Earl of Lonsdale in Cumberland. When he was 7, his mother died, and her 4 children, 3 boys, including William, were dispersed to live with other family members, which was commonly done in that day. I guess it wasn't expected that the fathers, who usually worked 12-hour days, would be able to take care of these children. And it would have been hard to finance in that day and age a nurse or teacher for most families. So they were dispersed to other family members. And this was not an unexpected outcome. There is another poem, another poet from that day that I want to read, and that's John Keats. I don't like to have this show go on too long, but it's hard to get through some of the poems by the Romantic poets quickly. John Keats was born in 1795 and died at age 26 of tuberculosis, of which his mother had died, and he had nursed a brother who had it until he too died. And of course, tuberculosis, looked at from a medical standpoint, was a major scourge of Western societies until well into the 20th century. I had an aunt who I never knew because she died young of tuberculosis, in spite of a great deal of money spent by the family to send her to tuberculosis sanitaria in a couple of different parts of the country. But in spite of John Keats' short lifespan, he turned out to be a brilliant poet. And he made it into the firmament of poetic heaven, I'm sure, and is still well regarded. Here is one of his poems which was recently reprinted in Poetry Magazine and which is also in the big book of romantic poetry that I bought for a vast price when I was a student in the 1950s. I think I may have paid $12 for this book. Yeah, no, not today. Okay, this is La Belle Dame Sans Merci, which means, of course, the beautiful woman without any thanks. Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge is weathered from the lake, and no birds sing. Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, so haggard and so woebegone? The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest done. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and then on thy cheeks a fading rose fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sidelong would she bend, and sing a fairy's song. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild in manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore, and there I shut her wild eyes with kisses for. And there she lulled me asleep, and there I dreamed, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamt. On the cold hillside I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried, La Belle Dame Sans Merci, thee hath enthralled. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here on the cold hillside. And this is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. He wrote that in 1819. That was coming somewhat to the end of the major English romantic period. But the poems of that sort influenced a lot of American poems, such as Longfellow, who came somewhat later. I hope you enjoyed the readings today. I can't say that the Romantics are on my list of favorite poems and poets, but the quality of their achievements is pretty impressive during a time before all the distractions of our modern age. All these poets wrote with quill pens. Think about that. Dipping into an ink bottle. Finding a publisher was not so easy, although if you were in the right circles in London, it was not so hard either. And usually depended on who you knew and who would recommend your work. But they persevered. That's it for today. Hope you'll tune in next week for another session. Maybe early American poets who were influenced by the Romantics. It's not decided yet, so be willing to take something else if it comes along. I hope you enjoyed today's potpourri, and I hope you have a good week to come. Bye now.